ChatGPT said the world was sitting at the table, watching closely. Every camera was on, every diplomat was whispering, and every reporter was ready to write the headline. Then India walked in, calm, confident, and silent. You could feel it in the air. Something big was about to happen. Everyone thought they knew what India would do. They thought India would accept another U.S. trade offer, smile for the cameras, and keep the global system rolling just like before. But this time, India didn't play by the old rules. This time, India said no. And that no wasn't just a rejection, it was a roar that echoed across continents. See, for decades, India's trade deals were treated like handshakes with conditions. Every deal came with invisible strings, policy alignments, political obligations, and quiet expectations. But not anymore. When India refused that U.S. trade offer, it wasn't just turning down a deal. It was turning down an entire mindset. That single decision sent shockwaves through Washington, Brussels, Beijing, and beyond. Because for the first time in a long time, the balance of power didn't shift from the West to another Western-backed country. It shifted to a nation that built its strength quietly through patience, resilience, and sheer willpower. Now let's be honest, no one saw it coming this fast. America expected India to play along. They offered incentives, promises, and partnerships. But India looked beyond the paper, beyond the fine print, and saw something deeper. A trade deal that favored dependency, not equality. India had learned that when the U.S. offers partnership, it often comes with a price tag hidden behind fancy words like cooperation and shared interests. And India decided it would no longer pay that price. You see, what makes this moment so powerful isn't just the refusal. It's what it represents. It's a declaration that India no longer needs validation from anyone to make global moves. India has the technology, the manufacturing power, the diplomatic reach, and the financial muscle to stand alone if it must. It's not arrogance, it's awareness. India knows its value now, and the world knows it too. But here's where it gets even more real. That decision didn't just affect one trade agreement, it rewired the global strategy board. Countries from Southeast Asia to Africa started watching India closely. They saw a developing nation stand up to the most dominant power in the world and say, "We decide what's best for us." That lit a fire across the global South. Nations that had been forced to pick sides began asking themselves, if India can do it, why can't we? And that's the moment the power balance shifted. Not with weapons, not with war, but with wisdom, because true power isn't about how much force you can show. It's about how much pressure you can resist. India resisted the pressure of politics wrapped in business. And that changed everything. Behind closed doors, there was silence in Washington. Policy experts couldn't understand why India would turn down such an offer. After all, it had access to billions in trade value, preferential tariffs, and access to Western markets. But India wasn't looking at short-term money. It was looking at long-term independence. Because sometimes the best deal you can make is the one you don't take. And let me tell you something, the world took notice. The European Union started reevaluating its approach to India. Japan reached out more urgently. Russia saw the opportunity to deepen ties. The Gulf states opened their doors wider. And African nations started aligning with India's trade models. Fair, balanced, and mutually beneficial. That's how influence spreads, not through force, but through example. Now think about this. When India made that announcement, the stock markets trembled for a moment. Analysts started shouting words like unpredictable, strategic risk, and diplomatic gamble. But what they didn't see was that India was playing a different game entirely. This wasn't about risk. This was about rewriting the rule book. For decades, the United States has used trade as a tool, a carrot to draw nations closer and a stick to control outcomes. But India flipped that. India used refusal as power. That no became a mirror that reflected something the world had forgotten. Real strength doesn't come from being accepted. It comes from being unshakable in your values. You have to understand, this wasn't a random move. India had been preparing for this moment for years. The Make in India initiative wasn't just about local manufacturing. It was about building the backbone of economic independence. The digital revolution wasn't just about apps. It was about data sovereignty. The partnerships with nations like France, Japan, and the UAE weren't just diplomacy. They were chess moves in a larger global game. India was silently building its house so that when the storm came, it wouldn't need shelter. It would be the shelter. When India said no to that U.S. trade offer, it told the world something powerful. We're not desperate for deals. We're designing our destiny. That's why it hit so hard, because the U.S. isn't used to hearing that. They're used to nations negotiating for survival, but India negotiated from strength. Now, don't think this was an act of defiance. It was an act of dignity. India didn't slam the door. It simply stood up and said, our door opens on our terms. There's a difference, and that difference defines the new India, assertive, strategic, and spiritually grounded in its own principles. When that news broke, you could almost hear the conversations happening in foreign ministries across the world. Some said India made a mistake. Others said it made history. But deep down, everyone knew something had changed forever. The old order, where Washington dictated and others followed, was over. The multipolar world that everyone talked about in theory had just become reality in practice. Let me paint you a picture. Imagine a giant chessboard. For years, one side, the West, moved its pieces freely while the others reacted. But now, India has moved a piece so bold, so unpredictable, that the whole board froze. Every grandmaster is studying that move, because for the first time, the rules don't seem so one-sided anymore. India has become the middle ground of the world, the bridge between East and West, tradition and technology, growth and governance. And that's exactly why its refusal carried so much weight. Because when a country that connects worlds decides to stand alone on principle, it forces everyone else to reconsider their path. And don't forget, India didn't do it with arrogance. It did it with silence, patience, and calculation. That's what scared the world most. It wasn't anger, it was composure. It wasn't rebellion, it was resolution. Because power isn't loud, it's control. Right now, behind the scenes, the U.S. is trying to figure out its next move. They're sending delegations, they're making new offers, they're trying to understand the new tone. But what they're realizing is that India doesn't need constant validation anymore. India doesn't need anyone to grant its status. It already earned it. The balance of power doesn't always shift with armies or alliances. Sometimes it shifts with a sentence. And India's sentence was simple. No. That word became the foundation of a new era. A world where developing nations are no longer clients, but partners. Where trade is not control, but cooperation. And here's something the world must understand. India's decision wasn't anti-American. It was pro-Indian. It wasn't against anyone. It was for everyone who believes in sovereignty, fairness, and respect. It was a message that said, we can work with you, but we will not work under you. That's what true independence sounds like. This moment will go down in history books, not as a confrontation, but as a correction. The correction of a world order that forgot what equality looks like. Because for too long, the balance of trade has been tilted by politics. For too long, countries have been told what to buy, what to sell, and how to behave. India just broke that chain, not by shouting, but by choosing. And that choice changed the conversation everywhere. You can see it already. Trade ministers from Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America are meeting in new formations. They're talking about fair pricing, local value addition, and mutual respect. They're talking about India as a model, not a junior partner. That's transformation in motion. Meanwhile, in India, people feel something they haven't felt in generations, pride mixed with peace. Because this wasn't about domination, it was about direction. It's about showing the world that standing firm doesn't isolate you, it elevates you. And as days pass, more nations are quietly taking India's side, even if they can't say it out loud. They're rethinking their dependency. They're planning their next move because they saw that the system can be challenged and survived. It's poetic, really. For years, India was told it was too slow, too complex, too bureaucratic. But that same patience is what gave it the strength to say no at the right moment. The world called it hesitation. India called it preparation. And when the silence broke and that announcement hit the airwaves, every capital, Washington, Beijing, London, Moscow, understood the same truth. The age of one-sided deals is over. India just proved that silence can shake empires and calm can shift the global order. Every global capital learned that India's silence before the announcement was not hesitation. It was preparation. Every global capital realized India's silence before the refusal wasn't weakness. It was preparation for dominance. For months before the trade announcement, diplomats, analysts, and business leaders were watching India closely, wondering what New Delhi's next move would be. Meetings were taking place behind closed doors. Phone calls were exchanged between embassies, and yet India said nothing. Not a hint, not a statement, not a single sign of which direction it would go. The world mistook that calm for indecision. They thought India was hesitating, but behind that silence was movement, strategic, deliberate, unstoppable movement. Inside South Bloc, there was no confusion. India's leadership knew exactly what was coming. They saw the trade offer for what it was, not an opportunity, but an instrument of leverage. A deal designed to open doors in one area and close them quietly in another. The kind of deal that looks attractive to the world but costs sovereignty in the fine print. So India decided to stay silent. That silence wasn't just the absence of words, it was the presence of calculation. The United States, used to nations rushing to respond, started getting impatient. They sent envoys, they floated statements, they even tried soft pressure through media leaks. But India didn't react, it didn't panic. It watched, it listened. It waited, because power doesn't always reveal itself through speech. Sometimes it reveals itself through stillness. Across London, Paris, Berlin, and Tokyo, that same question echoed. Why isn't India responding? The assumption was that India was torn between ambition and alliance. But the truth was simpler. India was preparing to lead, not follow. The trade offer was just one move in a much bigger game. The U.S. was offering partnership, but India was building position. What most people failed to understand was that India's silence wasn't born of fear. It was born of timing. For years, India had been aligning its domestic policies, reforming its industries, strengthening its economy, and diversifying its trade partners. It was creating an environment where no single country could dictate its future. So when the time came, India had the strength to say no, not emotionally, but strategically. And when that no finally came, it was like thunder after long silence. It wasn't shouted. It was announced calmly, officially, with precision. Yet the effect was seismic. Every global capital that had been reading India's silence as weakness suddenly realized it had been witnessing power in its purest form. Because true dominance doesn't show itself with noise. It shows itself with control. Let's take a moment to understand why that moment hit so hard. The world is used to seeing nations react. The United States makes an offer and countries respond, eager, defensive, or dependent. But India broke that cycle. It flipped the script. Instead of reacting, it dictated the pace. That changed the rhythm of global politics. When India finally spoke, the world listened, not because of volume, but because of the weight behind every word. You could feel the shift in the tone of world leaders. There was surprise, yes, but also respect. Because for the first time, India had shown it could resist pressure from the most dominant economy on earth and still maintain its composure. That kind of confidence doesn't come overnight. It's built through decades of discipline, through trial and patience. India's silence before the announcement had been filled with action. While others speculated, India had been building new alliances, deepening ties with France, strengthening trade with the UAE, opening corridors with Africa, and expanding digital cooperation with Japan and Southeast Asia. So by the time the U.S. made its offer, India already had alternatives. That's why the silence was so unnerving, because it meant India was playing from strength, not need. In Washington, policy experts began to realize what was happening. They started analyzing India's trade numbers, its domestic production surge, its digital economy boom, and its new trade pacts. They saw that India was no longer waiting for validation. It was becoming the validation. When you reach that point, silence becomes your strongest weapon, but the deeper story lies in psychology. For decades, India had been underestimated. The world saw it as a slow giant, full of potential but cautious to act. Yet that caution turned into power. It allowed India to study, to observe, to adapt, and to prepare. So when the moment arrived, that silence transformed into precision. India didn't need to rush. It knew time was finally on its side. Even the timing of India's refusal was deliberate. The world economy was unstable, inflation was high, energy routes were shifting, and new alliances were forming. The U.S. expected India to grab onto its offer like a lifeline. Instead, India looked at the global chaos and said, "This is the perfect time to show independence." That's leadership, because real power doesn't follow the storm, it moves through it. Other nations saw it too. In African capitals, leaders started discussing new frameworks for trade modeled after India's stance: fair, equal, and without hidden conditions. Southeast Asian ministers began speaking about strategic patience, a term inspired by India's calm approach. The Middle East started building stronger trade routes through India, recognizing that New Delhi had become the heart of a new economic geography. What India did was redefine diplomacy itself. It showed that silence can be a message louder than any speech. It reminded the world that sometimes restraint speaks more about readiness than words ever could. That's why global capitals were shaken. They realized India's quiet wasn't confusion, it was confidence in motion. When analysts in Europe and America began dissecting the refusal, they couldn't find chaos. There were no policy gaps, no panicked markets, no internal fractures. Everything was steady. That stability terrified them because it meant India wasn't reacting out of pressure. It was executing a plan. Look at how history usually unfolds. When powerful nations refuse deals, it's often out of defiance or ideology. But India's refusal came from strategy and self-assurance. That's what separates noise from dominance. India didn't burn bridges. It built its own road. It didn't reject cooperation. It redefined it. India's silence also tested who truly respected it. Some countries tried to exploit the moment, hoping to pull India closer to their side. Others waited cautiously, respecting its composure. That's when the hierarchy of respect in international politics started shifting. The world learned that you can't rush a country that moves with purpose. The more the silence stretched, the more powerful it became. Every unanswered question made global powers more aware that they no longer held control over the narrative. The power of the pause belongs to those who know what's coming next. And India knew. It wasn't improvising, It was executing a script written years ago through economic reform, technological independence, and diplomatic patience. This silence was not the kind of silence that comes from uncertainty. It was the silence of a nation aligning its stars. You could feel it in every decision India made: trade diversification, defense modernization, self-reliance in technology, and new partnerships that didn't depend on Western approval. Each move was a quiet step toward autonomy. When India finally said no, the message behind it was clear. We are not dependent, we are decisive. That's a sentence every global capital will remember, because what it truly meant was that India had reached a level of confidence where it no longer needed to explain itself. That's when silence becomes dominance. In power dynamics, there's something deeply unsettling about a quiet player who doesn't reveal their cards. The West wasn't prepared for that. They're used to predictability, to reading the next move through statements, leaks, or negotiations. But India changed that rhythm. Its unpredictability came not from chaos, but from control. That's a new kind of strength the world hadn't yet adjusted to. In Beijing, they analyzed it through the lens of rivalry. In Washington, they saw it as resistance. But in truth, it was neither. It was assertion. It was India saying, we will engage with the world, but on our own framework. And when that happens, the balance of power doesn't just shift, it resets. You see, India understood something the rest of the world is still learning. Silence has its own timing. It builds suspense, gathers strength, and then strikes with clarity. When India stayed silent before the refusal, it forced the global system to anticipate. That anticipation itself became a form of leverage. The longer India stayed quiet, the more valuable its eventual word became. The moment that word came, it reshaped perception. No longer was India the emerging economy waiting for inclusion. It became the decisive economy others needed inclusion from. That's how dominance begins, not with noise, but with necessity. Now, think about how this silence looked from the outside. The media try to fill it with speculation. India is unsure. India is negotiating quietly. India is divided internally. But when the final decision came, all those narratives collapsed. Because the silence wasn't uncertainty, it was unity. Every department, every policymaker, every diplomat knew exactly what direction India was heading in. The reason the world misread that silence is because they still saw India through an old lens, as a follower of global trends. But India was busy creating trends. It was shaping a new template for global independence, one where dignity is the base of diplomacy. That's why global capitals felt the shock so deeply. They realized they had been negotiating with an old mental model of India, the one that needed partnerships to be heard. What they met instead was the new India, the one that uses partnerships as a choice, not a crutch. In that realization came respect. Leaders began approaching India differently. Conversations shifted from persuasion to cooperation. Because when a nation masters silence, it masters attention. Every time India speaks now, the world listens, not because of its volume, but because of its silence before the words. You see, silence is the most elegant form of strength. It disarms arrogance, it confuses the impatient, and it inspires the observant. That's what India achieved. It turned the world's expectations into its own advantage. Every capital learned that India's silence wasn't hesitation. It was preparation for dominance. It was preparing through technology, developing its own semiconductor ecosystem. It was preparing through economy, becoming the world's fastest growing major economy. It was preparing through defense, building indigenous weapons and securing its borders without foreign dependency. It was preparing through diplomacy, forging a network of equal partnerships that transcended traditional alliances. So when the silence finally ended, it wasn't a pause breaking. It was power unveiling. The world had been watching a nation rehearse for its next chapter. And that chapter began not with applause, but with authority. Every global capital now measures its tone with India differently. They know one thing for certain. When India goes silent, again, it's not retreat, it's recalibration. It's the sound of power gathering before the world's next surprise. Because every global capital learned that India's silence before the refusal wasn't weakness. It was preparation for dominance.